And those emails were then mined for information by some people, presumably the climate deniers, and they brought out a couple of snippets which they felt were damning evidence that things were being fixed. One of them was an exchange of emails with other scientists on some evidence that had come out of another group, which was not was indicating that instead of warming, the temperatures were dropping, and saying that we need to think about how to explain that. And the other one was relating to whether or not this evidence or publication should be included in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the emails gave the view or the indication that these scientists would try and prevent that from happening. Now, these are two very minor incidents in the scientific debate. First of all, this isn't the only center that has the evidence. The evidence is very, very clear, and it goes across many different centers. So the Climate Research Unit at Stanley is not the only place. Secondly, temperatures will go down. Nobody's saying that every year and every day the temperatures are continuously going to go up. It's the trend that matters, and there may be years in which temperatures will go down, but overall we are seeing, as I said, there's been a 0.7 degree increase over the last century, and that's a real increase. The other point with respect to the IPCC is that even if they wanted to keep something out of the IPCC is an open process and it can't be kept out. It's reviewed by government, so anybody could have pointed out that this paper was not included and insisted that it be included.
This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC Chair Rajendra Pachauri, addressing the controversy today.
Given the wide-ranging nature of change that is likely to be taken in hand, some naturally find it inconvenient to accept its inevitability. The recent incident of stealing the emails of scientists at the University of East Anglia shows that some would go to the extent of carrying out illegal acts, perhaps in an attempt to discredit the IPCC. But the panel has a record of transparent and objective assessment stretching over 21 years, performed by tens of thousands of dedicated scientists from all corners of the globe. I'm proud to inform this conference that the findings of the AR4 are based on measurements made by many independent institutions worldwide that demonstrate significant changes on land, in the atmosphere, the oceans, and in the ice-covered areas of the Earth. The internal consistency from multiple lines of evidence strongly supports the work of the scientific community, including those individuals singled out in these email exchanges.
That was Rajendra Pachauri, who is addressing this issue, this controversy that Ivo de Boer, the head of the Climate Change Conference, has called extremely damaging. Lidy, Nacpil, anything you want to add on this issue? It's certainly become, to say the least, an issue at this time when this critical meeting is taking place.
Yeah, well, perhaps it's not very surprising that some quarters will try to undermine the credibility of scientists as well as the leaders of governments that are now meeting today. But I think we should not give much credence to these kinds of attempts to undermine the issue. I think we have reached a point after many years of debates that most, if not all of the world leaders, are convinced that the issue is indeed very urgent and that nothing must distract the leaders as well as the movements around the world from addressing the issues now.
Talk about extreme weather in the Philippines just in the last few months.
Well, I think everyone has seen in YouTube, as also in mainstream news broadcasts. In September, we suffered in the Philippines, in Metro Manila, an unprecedented disaster, and that was caused by a typhoon named Ondoy, where when we actually experienced rainfall we normally experience in 30 days happened in 6 hours. So it actually transformed Metro Manila, which is the capital of the country, to like raging rivers and lakes all around. So millions of families had to be driven away from their homes. Thousands of, hundreds of millions of dollars were actually worth of destruction happened in terms of cars, buildings, infrastructure. And I wish we could show the video right now, but because it really shocked everyone about how this could happen. And of course, there's a lot of factors, but you cannot deny that climate change has something to do with it. There's government neglect, of course. The infrastructures were not well maintained. But how can you otherwise explain something like this? And then it didn't stop there. Another typhoon came the following week. It caused massive destruction in the north, landslides, also hundreds of people were killed. And this hasn't happened to us ever. And this is now part of what we are seeing as very frequent disasters and worsening of typhoons in the last several years. So we can't say that climate change is not a factor to this.
What is climate debt, the issue of reparations in a sense?
Well, it has been an issue we've been raising in the last few years, that we should see the problem of climate change as a debt that is owed by the rich countries to the rest of the world, to the developing nations especially, but also to the south in the north, in the northern countries. This rests on what is clearly the responsibility of rich countries, of corporations, for creating the problem, for taking up the atmospheric space more than what they are entitled to, so that the rest of the world, the developing world especially, is deprived of that space and now have to deal with the impacts of the problem that they created. Democracy Now! Producer Mike Burke briefly had a chance on Sunday to question Ivo de Boer, the executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. He had just finished an interview with NBC and was racing to his next appointment when Mike and Elizabeth Press caught up with him.
Sir, can I ask you one question? We're working on a segment regarding the issue of climate reparations, and I want to know, is this something you support with the United States?
Reparations? What do you mean?
There's the concept of a climate debt, that the United States and other wealthy nations owe a debt to African nations and other developing nations.
Well, I think the fact that we're talking here about very significant money to help African countries adapt to the impacts of climate change and change the pattern of their economic growth is exactly intended to address those concerns that developing countries have.
And how much money is needed?
Over the short term, I think we need $10 billion a year for 2010, 2011, 2012.
That was Ivo de Boer, the head of the climate change conference. Now, interestingly, as we're going to air, it was announced that the U.S. Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank, has just given $3 billion to an Exxon-led consortium constructing a liquid natural gas plant in Papua New Guinea. Saleemul Huq, talk about the money that is going into subsidizing corporations' large projects versus this idea of debt and reparations.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues that we have to confront here, and hopefully Copenhagen will put us on that path, is how to wean ourselves globally off a very dangerous fossil fuel-dependent global economy, coal, oil, and natural gas, which we've invested trillions of dollars in and which corporations have invested trillions of dollars in and want to continue to protect their investments. We do need, as a globe, to move away from this into a cleaner, greener technology and energy pathway, and at the same time protect the most vulnerable citizens on this planet from the inevitable and unavoidable impacts of climate change. So we're talking about two sets of investments. Firstly, investments being moved from fossil fuel into new, cleaner energy, which in climate change jargon we call mitigation. And secondly, we are also talking about giving money to the poorest people on the planet to deal with the impacts that are not their making, but is the making of the rich, and hence the notion of debt. And that's in the climate change jargon called adaptation. So we're going to need money for mitigation and money for adaptation in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
And yet, for example, the United States has at this moment not pledged anything.
Well, they're beginning to pledge. They are talking about it. In fact, Congress has recently allocated funding for international climate finance, part of it for adaptation funding, so which wasn't the case under the Bush regime. So the Obama regime has actually reversed its antipathy to paying anything, but they haven't paid a lot yet, and they are going to have to up the ante along with other developed countries who are going to have to pay When you think of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be needed for this, one might think at one level that they're very large, but if you then compare them with the trillions of dollars that were produced out of thin air to pay banks in the recent recession, then saving the planet doesn't seem that expensive anymore. It surely is worth more than saving a few banks.